I want to welcome you to the CDRPC Fall Webinar Series. We'll be doing a series of these webinars every Wednesday, mostly at 11 o'clock. We'll have some at 3 o'clock like this one here. If you're joining us this afternoon, I want to thank you for coming to join us. We'll have an hour long with folks from New York State Department of State this afternoon, and we'll have a very engaging webinar. For those of you who do not know us, CDRPC is a regional planning and resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. We foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We work with partners to help them address regional issues. We were established this webinar series to help planners sharpen their skills and provide a vehicle for planning board members and zoning board of appeals members to obtain their credit hours. Planning board and zoning board of appeals members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training per year. Town, village, and city board of appeals and planning board members, as well as county planning board members, must receive this training. Municipalities have a wide latitude in determining what training is acceptable for credit. And after each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email confirming your attendance on this Zoom webinar. That email may be submitted to your municipality, either the chair of your board or the clerk, for consideration of credit to make sure that you get those 4 credits. In addition, for practicing AICP certified planners, we submitted this session and other sessions in the series for 1 hour of CM credit to the APA. The ethics session we have is an hour and a half. That'll be submitted for 1.5 hours. And then the law session we have queued up for December 23rd. We'll have that queued up for 1.5 hours of our law session. All right, nothing like a few early jitters on the webinar session. Some of the most common questions we get are the presentations archived? They will be archived. We'll make them available on the Eventbrite page that you use to access our slate of webinar series offerings. We also are recording this session, and we'll post that recording to the website as well, a link to that recording, so you can always come back and access it. So don't feel obligated to scribble down notes as you're kind of following along. We will have archives of the presentation available to people that register for the series. With that in mind. Now let's get to our presentation. With a growing population of older residents, are local steps being taken to ensure that they can live independently for as long as possible? What makes a community livable for older citizens, and how can they make sure that their community benefits people of all ages and physical abilities? This presentation will focus on land use planning and regulatory tools to help people in your community age in place. Topics will include a variety of housing choices like accessory dwelling units, what are called golden zones, and senior-friendly sidewalk and street designs to help our seniors remain in a community of choice or remain in the community that they want to live in for a longer period of time. We're joined today by Patricia Burke and Anurupa Roy. Patricia and Anurupa are both local government specialists at the New York State Department of State. And they're going to present this webinar today. I'm going to be operating the keys to ensure that we can use the presentation materials. So I believe everyone should be able to see the screen. And I want to welcome Patricia and Anurupa to presenting with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Anurupa and I are super happy to be presenting this important topic with you today. As we know, the baby boomers are here, and we're wondering if you're ready for them, if your community is ready for them. And the first thing we have to talk about is, what is aging in place? And according to the Center for Disease Control, aging in place is the ability to live in one's own home and community safely, independently, and comfortably, regardless of age, income, or ability level. And New York has the 3rd largest number of seniors in the United States, and they're a diverse population. They range in age from age 55 at the low end of the spectrum to over 100, and they have extremely varied traits, characteristics, preferences, and needs. And you know, from soup to nuts, everybody has to be planned for in New York State. And aging in place isn't just about having the right type of housing that suits Sorry, I thought the slide was flipping there. Aging in place isn't just about having the right type of housing that suits your stage in life, but it's also about the bigger picture, having a livable community for seniors and for every New Yorker. And a livable community is a good place to live, to work, to grow up, and to grow old. And 90% of those aging in place need family, friends, home health aides, and volunteers to help them along the way. And we want our seniors to stay in their homes, in their communities, and most importantly, in New York State. We don't want them to leave. And aging in place means growing older without needing institutional care. But the reality is that for those age 65 and older, 7 out of 10 will eventually need some form of long-term care. And the average nursing home is over $6,700 a month. So it makes good sense for us to enable seniors to live at home, to be comfortable and safe for as long as possible. And that's easier for seniors to do if they have a livable community. And some of the things on this list belong to the World Health Organization and AARP's 8 domains for a livable community. It means having affordable housing and having housing choices, walkable communities, so you can use sidewalks or multimodal paths like bicycle paths or just walking paths. And they have to be context sensitive. So they're not always going to look the same in a rural community versus an urban community. You have to have transportation choices and access to those transportation choices, because not everybody can drive or not everybody wants to drive. And you have to have a network of health support and other supportive services, maybe legal aid, access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and doctors. You have to have services. And crime can be actual crime or perceived crime, but it's important that seniors feel safe so that they will take advantage of amenities and walkability and get out and, you know, keep participating in life into their retirement. And you have to have opportunities for civic engagement. You know, one of the largest demographics of volunteers in the United States are seniors. You know, they have a lot of experience and they have the time to give back to their community. So next slide, please. So where do seniors actually want to live? If we were doing live training, I'd ask for a show of hands, you know, who wants to move away, or where do you want to live when you become a senior or when you retire? And the answer seems to be most Americans want to live in the community where they've already long lived, be that a rural place, a suburban place, or an urban place. It's a myth that most New Yorkers become snowbirds when they're 55 or when they retire and move to warmer climates. So interestingly, many of those who are over 80, those seniors are returning to New York. That's a really big demographic sector of people returning to New York. And the reason is they are moving closer to their family and other supportive systems like the healthcare systems. And this set of people is most likely to be widowed, frail, and poor. Next slide, please. This pie chart reveals that most seniors live in rural, urban, and suburban neighborhoods in almost equal percentages. So no one area is more important when it comes to addressing the needs of seniors and aging in place. And maybe you've heard the acronym NORC, N-O-R-C. That stands for a naturally occurring retirement community. And this is an apartment building or a neighborhood that wasn't specifically built for seniors. It was created by residents who have naturally aged in place. So parents who have stayed on after their children moved away, now they're living together in these neighborhoods or an apartment building. And maybe now they need support services that can enable them to maintain their independence. It can improve their quality of life, and it can avoid unnecessary hospital and nursing home stays. So New York State has a different definition of NORC, and that has to do with funding opportunities and other resources, but generally speaking, a NORC is a naturally occurring retirement community. And these folks are already managing because, because they're already in the good neighbor system, if you will. They get together and do Meals on Wheels, or they mow each other's lawns, or they pick up things or drive them to church. Like, they are just neighborhood people acting like good neighbors and helping each other to age in place. Next slide, please. And planning and zoning can encourage the development of a variety of housing options for all incomes and all physical abilities, such as elder cottages and senior housing developments. And land use regulations can create and maintain community character, giving neighborhoods a sense of place. And having design flexibility means that developers can incorporate walkability, recreation, open space planning, smart growth techniques, and even green technologies can be adapted into these communities. But we need to routinely update our comprehensive plans and our regulations so that we reflect the needs of our community. And we're going to keep saying over and over in this presentation, if it's good for seniors, then it's good for people of any age and any physical ability in your community. So there are a whole host of benefits to adapting your community so that people can age in place as gracefully as possible. And now I'll turn it over to Anurupa.
Thank you, Trish. Next slide, please. So Trish already mentioned that how important it is that we plan for the aging population. And just to give you some numbers here, about 17% of the total population in the country is 65 years or above. This figure is estimated to rise to 22% by 2050. So you see, it is a significant part of the total population. Therefore, planning for such a large and growing population should be a priority, not only because of the rising numbers, but also because that is the right thing to do from a community standpoint. According to a 2010 American Association of Retired Persons, or the AARP survey, nearly 90% of those over the age of 65 want to stay in their residence for as long as possible, as Trish mentioned. The senior population is mostly on a fixed or limited income, who often have difficulty finding affordable housing and safe and accessible means of transportation. Thus, various planning tools can largely facilitate successful aging in place. Comprehensive plans and zoning are some of the foundational planning tools in this context. However, it is important to remember that not all communities have comprehensive plans. Even zoning is not adopted by all communities. But if a community has zoning, it must be in accordance with a comprehensive plan. Municipalities which haven't adopted zoning laws have the options for other land use regulations, such as site plan review. Nevertheless, it is important to note that zoning really increases a municipality's ability to regulate land use greatly. This is mainly due to the possibility of influencing the intensity, design, and patterns of development. For instance, zoning can be used to facilitate the affordable housing goals of a municipality as expressed in its comprehensive plan. And at the same time, it can achieve this goal while minimizing environmental impacts and maintaining community character. We will be exploring some of those options in our presentation today. Next slide, please. The comprehensive plan, as we all are somewhat aware of, is an expression of a community's goals and visions for organized growth in the future. But before you can plan for your future, you must first take into account your existing conditions and natural resources. The plan should address at least the topics that are mentioned in the slide. I will just briefly go over some of the important considerations and questions that need to be asked while drafting your comprehensive plan. First, A review of your land use designations should consider if there is room for new development. And if there is, then where should the development be promoted? For instance, if there is no open space for development, should infill development be encouraged? Should senior housing complexes be built on available land or closer to walkable amenities in the center of a town? The demographic aspect should consider your existing senior population and the projected number of senior people in your community. It may very well be the case that the demand for senior housing has increased manyfold, which did not exist about 20 years back. Further, what about your current housing stock? Consideration should be given to the housing quantity, quality, and the types for your existing and projected needs. Maybe your community has enough single-family housing, but it does not adequately consider accessibility issues for the people with disabilities. Also, you may need to consider whether your current zoning allows for multi-unit apartments. You may ask why that is important, and we will talk about it a little later. It is crucial to remember to include a review of affordable housing opportunities as well. As mentioned earlier, seniors tend to live on fixed incomes and have less money to devote to housing. Transportation review includes streets, sidewalks, and access to public transportation, as well as a variety of transportation choices to help seniors to stay connected with their families and friends, and of course, amenities that increase their ability to live on their own. In this regard, complete streets design accommodates all modes of transportation, including conventional transit modes, walkers, bikers, wheelchair users, and so on. And we will be talking about complete streets in more detail a little later. Linking streets to parks and to downtown centers encourage seniors and others who may not drive to get out and about for their daily routines. Seniors want to remain physically fit and independent for as long as possible, so one must take into account their recreational needs as well. It's important to consider what kind of parks and open spaces does your community have or want to have. Are your current parks accessible for people of all physical abilities? Do they reflect recreational choices such as tennis or swimming? Moreover, do not forget to check whether you have a disaster preparedness plan that takes into account the special needs of the elderly of all physical abilities and also their pets. Incidentally, during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, many seniors refused to leave their pets behind. So new federal and state laws mandate that municipalities must plan for pet evacuations, and plans should include transportation options for those traveling with pets. Next slide, please. The power to zone for health and safety lies in the hands of the local governments. Zoning regulates the use of land by dividing the municipality into districts and regulates the placement, spacing, and size of buildings within those districts. The overall goal is to avoid incompatible land uses so that any possible disagreements and tension can be proactively mitigated. The courts have determined that it is entirely legal and necessary to consider the needs of the elderly when zoning for housing. A case in point is in Orange County when the village of Harriman annexed property in town of Monroe. It was zoned for general business and residential uses were prohibited. The court concluded that the annexation is in the overall public interest and there is an undisputed need for senior citizen housing in the area. And the development of such housing would be an undeniable benefit to both the town and the village. Therefore, the court ruling said that the town's concern over the loss of potential commercial tax rates is outweighed by the benefit of much needed senior housing. In fact, if zoning makes constructing affordable housing too difficult, it can be challenged and most likely it will be invalidated as exclusive zoning. Hence, if the zoning regulations do not facilitate the development of affordable housing or opportunities for senior housing, then it is advisable to revisit your regulations and those should be amended accordingly. Next slide, please. Zoning and subdivision controls may limit or facilitate the home type to be built. For example, they might not allow condominiums and cluster developments, or zoning may not allow temporary structures or accessory apartments as permanent structures because they are perceived to have an adverse effect on property values, as well as neighborhood character. This in turn may eliminate the possible development of elder cottages or in-law apartments. The American dream is often equated with single-family home ownership rather than the mixed-use housing needs of seniors, such as apartments, elder cottages, congregate housing, and so on. Communities may fail to plan for seniors to age in place because they are unaware of the need. Unfortunately, planning is often reactionary, that it is only happens when an issue has already occurred. As a popular saying goes, failing to plan is planning to fail. So it is important to take proactive measures. Next slide, please. Senior citizen housing districts, or as they are also known in different names, such as retirement community district or age-restricted clustered housing or planned adult community or planned retirement congregate housing communities, are becoming more common in municipalities that are addressing the need for this type of housing through zoning. There are additional tools for adding greater flexibility to zoning laws in the hands of local governments, such as overlay district, which establishes regulations to achieve a specific public purpose, such as senior housing. The overlay is usually applied over conventional zoning districts for areas that require special attention, such as an environmentally sensitive area or a rapidly developing strip corridor. Additionally, a floating zone is a zoning district that delineates conditions which must be met before the zoning district can be approved for an existing piece of land. Rather than being placed on the zoning map as traditional zones, the floating zone is simply written as an amendment in the zoning ordinance. Thus, the zone floats until a development application is approved. Then the zone is added to the official zoning map. Floating zones can be used to plan for future land uses that are anticipated or desired in the community, but are not confirmed yet, such as senior housing or any other affordable housing programs. One caveat to note here, if there is not enough backing for a floating zone in a comprehensive plan, it might give rise to problems such as unhappy neighbors may accuse the municipality of spot zoning, which is basically using the zoning regulations for the benefit of one or a few landowners for individual interests by zoning their property differently from those surrounding them, thus disregarding the general interest of the neighborhood or the community. As a side note, floating zones are not considered specifically in the enabling statutes, but are considered lawful within the general statutory grants of zoning power. Next slide, please. Further, incentive zoning is an innovative and flexible technique of exchanging developer bonuses for community amenities. Properly applied, incentive zoning can be a win-win for the developer and for the community. For example, if a developer wants to build an upscale 5-story senior housing complex in an area where only 2-story buildings are allowed, then the community might allow this increased density in exchange for something it wants for the greater good of the community, such as more affordable housing units. The developer would then make a certain percentage of those new units available to low-income and moderate-income people in exchange for those higher buildings or the high rises. Incentive zoning can increase the potential for development to occur in certain locations like infill areas where existing infrastructure is underutilized. It can be an effective means of implementing goals of the comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. In short, zoning can support senior-friendly housing options. Many current zoning regulations separate land uses, which can increase social isolation among older adults. It is thus important to consider different types of housing options, keeping in mind the needs of the elderly population. Trish will now talk more on this. Over to you, Trish.
Okay, thank you, Anurupa. Next slide, please. All right, as with many senior housing options, there are currently no state-level statutes or regulations pertaining to accessory dwelling units. And by the way, on the Department of State's website, we have 2 model laws to help you if you wanted to take them and use them for your own community. They're quite lengthy, but the idea behind any model law is you don't adopt it in its entirety. You pick and choose the portions of it that will reflect the needs of your community. So we do have 2 model senior housing laws. And also at the Department of State, we provide local government officials, planning boards, and zoning board members with sample zoning and sample local laws of what other municipalities are doing. So you don't have to go it alone. You can ask us for help, and we provide those for illustrative purposes only. It's not that we are particularly endorsing one law or one zoning definition of a particular municipality, but just know that you can avail yourselves of those. That's what we do in the training department. And here we have ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And these can either be, these are permanent changes to a house. They can either be inside the original house or adjacent to the existing home. Sometimes they can be freestanding, but in this example, it is an attached garage situation with an apartment over the garage. And sometimes these are referred to as granny flats when they're within the building. That's a term that we hear a lot down in Florida, but we hear it in New York as well. In Long Island, we see these types of buildings referred to as mother-daughter units. You know, it's like a split-level ranch situation. It's called a mother-daughter. So either the senior or their caregiver can live in the accessory dwelling unit. And this can be really helpful because maybe the senior can't take on the maintenance or the property taxes or the expenses of living in that big house anymore. And maybe they move to the ADU and their caregiver takes over the main part of the house. It doesn't matter, but be careful when you're drafting your regulations that you use the term senior or their caregiver. You probably should stay away from saying senior or their family member because you may be inadvertently, you know, excluding particular people from being able to live in one or the other of these housing choices. Next slide. Oh, wait, before we switch, notice how this blends into the existing community. It's already harmonious because they are using similar paint and similar architectural styles. So it's kind of harmonious with the existing neighborhood. And that's good because accessory dwelling units can get a little pushback from critics saying that, you know, it's gonna detract from property values and it's a form of affordable housing. We don't want that in our neighborhood. And you can see in this example with design guidelines, you can really make these types of residences amenities for your community. So next slide, please. There are a lot of considerations for you to think about when you're deciding whether or not to let these exist in your municipality. If you do allow them, should they only be allowed for existing homes or for new homes or for both? If you only allow them for new homes, then you're not doing a lot to spur revitalization or infill development in the existing neighborhood. And if you're only allowing them for new homes, you're kind of, maybe you'll be inspiring more development where you don't necessarily want to see it. Or you could find the Goldilocks approach and allow them in both types of development. Do you want to have them as attached, or do you want them to be standalone, such as, you know, a studio apartment in the backyard that's completely detached? Should they be given relaxed review standards? If you're trying to encourage senior housing or caregiver housing, then you may not necessarily have to have the traditional, you know, 2 parking spaces allowed, like you would if you were converting a regular house into, or subdividing a regular house into apartments, because the seniors just may not need that number of parking spaces. It may be dumb in that particular neighborhood. Should they be given relaxed standards? You know, oftentimes, if you find yourself in this position of, you know, trying to accommodate a home for mom or dad, you may be constrained by an emergency situation. So do you want to have the review process sped up for your permitting applications? Should they be given real property tax exemptions? You know, the more property tax exemptions you give out to seniors or to a specific group, then that burden is dispersed among the other property owners in the municipality. And for some exemptions, you know, you're not allowed to have grandchildren or children living on the property or in the home if they're already getting a senior housing real property tax exemption. And should they be given design guidelines or architectural review? As I mentioned in that prior photograph, you know, this can assuage a lot of fears of detracting from property values. If they're really well done and well maintained and they blend into the community, they can be a real asset. And, you know, architectural review and design guidelines may give you more assurances that the ADU will conform to your community character and blend in more harmoniously. Next slide. And we have a lot more considerations. This is a nice example of a garage apartment. How many units will you allow on a lot? For most people, it would be 1 unit per lot. But what if you have a large lot? You know, what if, you know, a husband and wife each wants to have their own parent move in separate little houses, or the tiny house movement? You can decide for your community how many dwelling units you will have on the lot. How many occupants are you going to allow in each unit? That's an important thing, because do you want the caregiver living with the senior, or are they to live elsewhere? And what about grandchildren or great-grandchildren possibly moving in? You know, if the caregiver has their own children, you know, now how many people are you up to in this dwelling unit? So you can restrict that. It's a good idea to have periodic renewals for your permits. That will ensure that whoever is supposed to be living in that dwelling unit is living there. For example, if the senior moves on, it's no longer needed for the senior's use. You know, some communities think, oh, good grief, you know, what if, you know, the college kids move in now? And that was never our intention. So you can have periodic renewals to ensure that whoever is living there is supposed to be living there. And what are you going to do about illegal accessory dwelling units? As I mentioned before, some people make these conversions out of an emergency or out of necessity. They're not necessarily trying to circumvent the law or the permitting process, but they find themselves in a bind. So what are you going to do? Will you have an amnesty program to allow them, if they bring themselves up into conformance with current building codes? It's up to you how you want to handle that. Will you allow home occupations and signage? And what about people visiting for the home occupation, sales and such? Where will your utility service connections be? Will they be at the front where they're very easy to find? Will you notify adjacent property owners during the permit process or perhaps during the public hearing process if this is a zoning issue? And how about a periodic or an automatic ADU legislation review? Because as we see these things becoming more and more popular, we have different versions of them, and it's a good idea to have any legislation periodically reviewed to make sure that it's reflecting what the current needs actually are. And you know, if you're getting a lot of use variances, that is a red flag that your zoning is out of whack or your comprehensive plan is out of whack and perhaps needs to be reviewed so that you can accommodate these new living and new lifestyle choices. Next slide. Now this is an example of an ECHO. It's an elder cottage housing option. It's non-permanent. It almost looks like a little FEMA trailer. It's designed to be temporary. So when the senior no longer needs it, it's removed. And this example comes to us from Better Housing of Tompkins County. I have to tell you that I don't think these are as successful as people had hoped they were, because they're very expensive to remove after the senior no longer is living there. So we have this as an example of, you know, not everything works in every community. And these are also based on a sliding scale for income qualified people in Tompkins County. So if you're going to have something like this, you might want to make sure that you have something in your permit or your legislation that really addresses the termination and the removal. But again, these are designed to be non-permanent in the first place. Next slide. Here are some considerations for ECHOs. They're very similar to the accessory dwelling unit considerations. All of those things that we just went over. They will be subject to your local zoning requirements. They're subject to health codes because generally they need to be hooked up to sewer and septic or public sewer if you're in that kind of urban or more urban situation. Will you allow them as temporary structures? And when should they be removed? By that I mean, how long after the senior is no longer needing it? Within a year, within 6 months? And identify any of those installation and removal fees so that there are no surprises at the end of the process. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about a form of subdivision called cluster development. It's different from conservation subdivision or conservation development because in conservation, first of all, you identify how much of the parcel you want to be conserved or deleted from the building envelope before you continue with your subdivision. But in cluster subdivision, this is a modification of your existing zoning. It is density neutral, so you are not creating any more units than would ordinarily be allowed under your conventional zoning. So in this example, in the bottom right corner, we have the farmhouse. This is a traditional layout of a farm being subdivided. So for example, one house on every 5 acres. And you can see where this would really chew up the land quite quickly. Next slide, please. If you adopt cluster development, now you can see the buildings, the homes are clustered closer together, and they are taking advantage of open land, scenic qualities, natural features. So it's a good thing. It's using less infrastructure, so extending less paved roads, less sewer and water. You can use sidewalks, porches, anything that would encourage walkability and eyes on the street to encourage a more social living environment, which is great for senior housing because you want to encourage a social community environment where, you know, people look out for each other. And they, you know, when you live in this type of place and you look across the street and you think, Oh, well, I didn't see John open up his blinds today. I wonder if everything is okay. People just naturally would look out for each other because they have that form of community spirit, if you will. So you can either mandate where you would want to see this kind of cluster development happen. By that, I mean in districts or geographical areas, or you can mandate or encourage it by the type of development itself. So you can say, every senior housing development we want in our community, we want cluster to be an available option, or you can even take it a step further and say, we're going to mandate that these homes be clustered together. Next slide. And mixed use development, you know, pedestrian connection options for seniors. You know, this is traditional development where first floor was retail and services, and mom and pop lived above the shop, or other residential things happened on the second and third and fourth floors. And the idea is, when you have mixed use development, you are encouraging a more social lifestyle for people with access to amenities, doctors, services, transportation, retail shopping, all of the things that make up that livable community that we went over in the very beginning of the show. And traditional zoning has separated our land uses, and it's almost mandated that, you know, our uses could be so far apart that people are reliant upon a vehicle, and if they don't have their own vehicle, public transportation, which is not always available in rural communities. So when we get back to this mixed use development, it really can contribute to the livable community. Next slide. Is this you, Anarupa? No? No?
No,
Me?
it's
It's
you.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. So neo-traditional neighborhoods, this is new urbanism. So we're getting back to those neighborhoods that foster walkability and porches. And if you do have a garage, or, you know, then you access that garage through an alleyway or a driveway off to the side. Public transit access is available. You may have to walk a block or two, but the streets are narrow and tree-lined as opposed to a traditional subdivision where the roads are filled with cul-de-sacs that don't necessarily lead to anywhere. They're dead end. They lack connectivity. Trees, the landscaping acts as green infrastructure and stormwater management on site. And you can take advantage of green technologies, which is, you know, part of smart growth. So we are trying to get back to these neo-traditional neighborhoods, which encourage foster more of a community setting in the proper environmental setting as well. Next slide. And site plan review, excuse me, has to do with the development of a single parcel. It doesn't matter how many buildings are on that parcel, but it's a single parcel ranging from a single family home to a senior housing development. You can only hold developers or applicants, you can only hold their feet to the fire for things that are identified in your specific site plan review law. So taking a look at site plan review through the lens of senior housing, you would want to address universal design and accessibility. Universal design means that it's good for all users. It's not stigmatizing a particular user, like you don't say a handicapped ramp. You would just say a ramp. That way somebody with a wheelchair or a baby carriage could use it. Where is your emergency vehicle access going to be? Anarupa is going to talk about street design standards and sidewalk design standards, but these are all things that you can hold the developer accountable for. And if you know what you want ahead of time, it's only going to make your project better when you were the one in charge saying, we want A, B, C, and D, and not just merely accepting what the developer is handing to you. Like, you really have the power to ask for things when they're identified in your site plan review. Next slide.
That's me.
Okay.
This picture, if you see, is from Charlotte, North Carolina, and notice that it features a variety of street users with different abilities. So if you look closely, you can see a bicyclist and then public transportation riders, drivers, pedestrians, and also older people and children here. So complete streets should be designed with all users in mind, as the picture here depicts. Through research, it has been found that grid-style streets, which intersect at about right angles, are safer and more user-friendly than non-grid style street design, which is mostly common in suburban areas, making pedestrian access and navigation difficult and confusing, especially for seniors. Also, long streets and wide streets are difficult for seniors and people with disabilities to cross. So these are some of the important considerations while street designing for the senior population. Traffic calming devices like speed bumps and raised pedestrian crossings can slow traffic and give a sense of safety to pedestrians. Also, landscaping with native species of plants, such as the plants which are natives, use less water and helps in absorbing greenhouse gases and stormwater runoff. This is not only important in lending a sense of place, but also a wise environmental choice. One thing to remember is a complete street in a rural area will look quite different from a complete street in a highly urban area, which Trish has mentioned earlier. But both aim at balancing safety and convenience for everyone using the road. For example, roads surrounded by agricultural uses may be considered complete in the sense by simply providing wide shoulders to allow safe bicycling and walking, and also by providing connections to regional trail and public transportation networks. Sometimes rural communities may think that they do not need complete streets, or they might ruin their community character by having or adopting them. However, rural communities and small towns tend to have higher concentrations of older adults, as we had seen in the pie chart at the beginning of the presentation, and low-income citizens. Now, these are two groups of people that are less likely to own cars or drive. Therefore, without safer roads, those with limited transportation options have little choice, which is either to travel along high-speed roadways with few pedestrian facilities or just stay home. Now, this in turn increases the risk of isolation from the community. Next slide, please. Here are a few items that basic sidewalk design should generally address. But before I go into it, please remember the difference between guidelines and standards. Guidelines are recommendations and standards are requirements. The minimum width for sidewalks is 4 feet according to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. We usually see that in residential areas. As adjacent land uses become more and more intense in medium density areas like townhouses, that minimum increases to 6 feet and to 10 feet in urban corridors. However, the Federal Highway Administration recommends sidewalks to be at least 5 feet in width if set back from the curb, or 6 feet if at the curb face. According to them, any width less than this does not meet the minimum requirements for people with disabilities. Walking is a social activity. For any two people to walk together, 5 feet of space is the bare minimum. In some areas, such as near schools, sporting complexes, some parks, and many shopping districts, the minimum width for a sidewalk is 8 feet. Some shopping districts require 20, 30, or even 40 feet of width to handle the volumes of pedestrian traffic they encounter on a daily basis. Thus, any existing 4 feet wide sidewalks often force pedestrians into the roadway. Therefore, what my point is, it is a good idea to not only consider the minimum requirements, but also to look into the guidelines and study the specific area and its needs while planning for sidewalks. With regard to surfaces, those can be concrete or brick or pavers. Uniform surfaces make it easier for seniors and mobility impaired to travel. Also, don't forget to address the seasonal maintenance issues like snow removal and repairs. Design standards can help to give your community a cohesive and harmonious feel when benches, light posts, and landscaping all have a common look and feel. A combination of these little things can create that sense of place, which all, including the seniors in a community, would much appreciate. Next slide, please. The main consideration while planning for transportation to help seniors to age in place is definitely safety first. Seniors must be safe behind the wheel and on the sidewalks or while using any other mode of transportation. As have been mentioned earlier, most seniors like to continue to live in the same community. But in order to do so, they need to be able to access the support, services, and amenities that they will require as they age, such as making trips to the grocery store or to the doctor's office or visiting a friend's home. Such trips typically are taken by car. But changes in eyesight, motion ranges, reaction time, and even medications can affect drivers from day to day on a regular basis from driving safely. Unsafe drivers of any age not only endanger themselves, but anyone else near the roads and sidewalks. Often a driver's license is a senior's last chance at independence, and they are fearful of giving that up. But in most cases, they have to continue driving due to lack of alternative transportation options. Since people live an average of 7 to 10 years beyond their ability to drive safely, seniors will need alternative transportation choices to maintain their independence, along with more innovative, affordable, and accessible options. These alternatives can reduce reliance on the use of personal car and on fossil fuels in general. So we all know like how New York State have been trying to curb the use of fossil fuels. So this can be a productive and a constructive step towards that. In European countries where cities are denser and there is better pedestrian infrastructure, up to 50% of seniors walk or bike compared to just 8% of American seniors. In US, the existing built environment and transportation infrastructure in the communities lack safe, viable options such as public transit, biking, or walking. However, there are some senior-friendly programs around different cities in US where they are focused on supporting seniors in their transportation and mobility needs. For example, in Palm Beach County in Florida, the Palm Tran operates Seniors in Motion program, a comprehensive public awareness and training program for seniors aged 75 or older living in the county. 2 full-time trainers have taught many individuals how to ride the bus and use rail services through seminars and presentations at senior clubs, community centers, and other senior-oriented gatherings. Lane Transit District in Eugene, Oregon, operates a one-on-one training initiative called the Bus Buddy Program. The district recruits regular bus drivers, known as bus builders, to serve as volunteers and teach seniors how to plan trips and navigate routes. Also, since 2001, the city of Santa Rosa in California provided 1 week of free bus passes for seniors. During this week, the city provided riding tips on where to ride and when to ride to avoid student rush hours. The Bus Buddy program here as well pairs seniors up with escorts to provide personalized bus training to improve confidence and familiarity with the system. Next slide, please. Since 2012, New York requires all county and local transportation projects which are undertaken by the State Department of Transportation, or for projects that receive both federal and state funding and are subject to state DOT oversight, to consider adopting complete street design, features, and practices, keeping in mind the convenient access and mobility on the road network by all users, including drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transportation users. Next slide, please. So as I've been discussing, there is no size fits all, there is no one size fits all design prescription for complete streets. Each one is unique and should be guided by the community context. A complete street may include sidewalks, bike lanes or wide paved shoulders, special bus lanes, comfortable and accessible public transportation stops, frequent and safe crossing opportunities, median islands, accessible pedestrian signals, curb extensions, narrower travel lanes, or extra large lettered overhead street name signs can be more senior friendly. And these kind of facilities or these kind of design guidelines would help in promoting safer streets and complete streets. Next slide, please. It might seem quite intuitive that why not have streets which meet the needs for all in the community. That not only seems to be a smarter choice, but also a more perceptive one. But unfortunately, often this basic principle is ignored while planning. Thus, it is important to remember that complete street design is not only beneficial to the senior age group alone, but it caters to the wider population, thereby meeting better safety standards for all. Trish will now wrap things up here. Over to you, Trish.
Okay, thanks, Anurupa. Well, I think we've talked about a lot. Next slide, please. Thank you. Fostering an aging in place situation, it takes a village, as they say. Creating a livable community for all ages, abilities, and income, having that balanced community will enrich your community and make it a really great place to live, to work, to grow up, and to grow old. And it takes collaborating with people from different disciplines and different agencies. So training exercises like this will get you out and talking and learning from the case studies of other municipalities what's worked and what hasn't worked. And we hope that you will come to us if you have any more questions. We can elaborate on anything, but it's 4 o'clock now. Here are resources for more information. And if Martin says we can take questions, we can take questions. But other than that, thank you for allowing us to train with you today.
Whoops, I realize that when I'm hitting the button, I'm advancing your slides. I apologize. So I have your contact information up on the screen if folks want to get in touch with you or have questions for the training unit or council's office in New York State Department of State. I want to thank you for your time. I haven't seen any questions come across the chat function, but if people do have questions, they're more than welcome to email me. I'll pass them along, or to email the folks at Department of State if they do have questions. I do want to mention again, we do archive this presentation. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can show you what our page will look like. We will archive these presentations on our Eventbrite site. And if my computer is now going to cooperate with me, it's always, this is the first one in the series. It's always the first one that we tend to get these issues on. Who knows why? Give me a moment, and I'm going to hit screen share again. Okay. Share this. So for folks that have registered for this session, this is kind of the behind the paywall Eventbrite page. and this is where we will be posting the information for the webinars. We'll archive the material as well. So this will kind of function as a clearinghouse. It'll be on the same Eventbrite page that you use to access and register for webinars. We have a number of events lined up. For example, next week we're going to have on October 21st, Creative and Resilient Planning During COVID-19. That's presented by MJ Engineering as our presenting sponsor. So keep coming back to that page. You can find your archives and you can find descriptions of the upcoming sessions. Patricia, you had mentioned there are some model local codes that communities can take advantage of on DOS's website. If you want, if it's possible, if you want to send me a link to where that exists on the website, I can make sure we send that out or include that as a link to the session description and archives.
Okay, sure. The easiest thing.
Folks will have it.
I'm happy to do that, but if people want to look it up on their own, just use a search engine, NYSDOS Model Local Law Senior, and that should bring them up.
Okay. And for those folks who are looking for the AICP credits, we did submit this session to the APA. They will have that available on their website so you can log your credits there. For folks who are looking to use this session for their hour of time for planning and zoning board credits, at the end of the email or at the end of the session, our attendees will get an automatically generated email which will provide a description of the session. You can take that either to the chair of the planning or zoning board that you serve on, or to your community clerk in order for consideration of those required credits for your community. With that, I'm not seeing any more questions popping up. So oh, we do have a question. Oh, we got a question. Okay. Yes, that's in front of the paywall, correct. Sorry, I had the wrong screen up, but yes, you'll be able to access this behind the paywall where you'll find the session descriptions and register links that are on the Eventbrite site. So when you log in, you'll be able to see all the sessions. We're consistently updating that, providing additional sessions. For example, today I added in information and a registration link for December 23rd's law session. So you'll be able to access all this information and archive presentation and a video presentation of this webinar as well for folks that wanted to revisit that. So without any additional questions, I do want to thank our presenters, Patricia and Anurupa today. Thank you for taking time to speak with us. Let me see, I'm looking at the chat. Yes, people are all muted. That way we don't have anybody interrupting the session. I see that somebody posted in the link in the chat for the publications and senior housing resources. So I certainly appreciate that. If folks want to open up the Q&A and chat, you'll be able to access those links as well. I'll make sure those are referenced in the material section where I provide the link and a link to the video and a link to the PDF as well. So with that, thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully we'll see you again next week and for next Wednesday's webinar when we talk about COVID impacts on planning. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.